Thank you for tuning in to the Practical Preservation Podcast. Please take a moment to visit our website, practicalpreservationservices.com, for additional information and tips to help you restore your historical home. If you've not done so, please subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud, and also like us on Facebook. Welcome to the Practical Preservation Podcast, hosted by Danielle and Jonathan Kepperling. Kepperling Preservation Services is a family-owned business based in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, dedicated to the preservation of our built architectural history for today's use as well as future generations. Our weekly podcast provides you with expert advice specific to the unique needs of renovating a historic home, educating by sharing our From the Trenches preservation knowledge and our guests' expertise, balancing modern needs while maintaining the historical significance, character, and beauty of your period home.
Today on the Practical Preservation Podcast, we have Scott Hanson with us, and he's the author of the book, Restoring Your Historic Home. Scott, tell me about your background.
Well, I grew up in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, where there are many historic buildings, and one in particular that always fascinated me was the abandoned Boston and Maine Railroad station sitting in the middle of my little New England village. Throughout my childhood, early childhood, it just sat there with peeling paint, and passenger service had stopped before I was born. And it's a really spectacular Victorian-era railroad station. And when I was 11, I noticed some activity happening around the building. The broken glass was getting raked up, and sometimes I would see smoke coming out of the chimney, like someone was in there. So the station was next door to the post office where my grandfather worked, and one day when I was downtown and had gone into the post office to say hello to my grandfather, I looked over and saw the door open at the railroad station and went over and introduced myself to the man who was there working on it. And I became a volunteer at what became the Conway Scenic Railroad in North Conway, New Hampshire. And so my first introduction to historic preservation was that project. And I helped work on the buildings. I helped work on a steam locomotive and railroad equipment, and had this amazing opportunity to learn from a really diverse group of individuals who were interested both in railroads and historic preservation.
Right.
And it was just a wonderful introduction to the field, working with some amazing, particularly the old railroad guys, who could fix anything, with just this amazing body of knowledge in their heads, and a really practical, down-to-earth, let's get it done approach that came out of their railroading background. So that's where I got my start. And then I pursued an education in art and design at Pratt Institute in New York after high school. And while poking around the Pratt Library, I discovered architectural history as a field. Not just, oh, wow, that's a great old building, but, oh, wow, I can identify what style that building is and what its features are, and fit it into a progression of styles over time. And so that provided the beginning of an academic foundation for my interest. And over time, I just followed those interests to become a carpenter and a designer and a painter, and through the years, just built up a body of knowledge about historic buildings, how they're put together, what awful things get done to them over time, how to undo those awful things.
Right.
And eventually worked as a municipal planning department employee, administering the historic preservation ordinance for the city of Portland, Maine. And from there, eventually became a historic preservation consultant, which is what I've done for the past decade, while writing a few books along the way.
Well, that's an interesting and diverse background, but I think it's pretty typical for people who, at least that seems more often than not, people that I encounter in preservation, where they, fall in love with older buildings, and then they kind of figure out a way to make that, work to make money.
Exactly.
So I know you mentioned that you've written several books, but tell me about your newest book, the Restoring Your Older Home.
Restoring Your Historic House.
Oh, sorry. I was calling it the wrong name. I'm sorry.
No problem. More than happy to correct that.
Yeah, and it's really bad because I'm sitting here looking at it and I'm just reading the wrong words.
So, Restoring Your Historic House, the Comprehensive Guide for Homeowners, is a book that I waited 30 years for someone else to write. When I got involved in the field, I went looking for a really comprehensive guide to restoring historic houses. And there are a lot of books out there on the topic, but I never could find the one that really comprehensively addressed the subject. A lot of the ones that are out there are very good in a particular part of the process, or provide great information if you want to turn a historic house into a new house.
Right.
But there was really nothing comparable to Michael Litchfield's Renovation, A Complete Guide, which is a really wonderful resource for renovating any house, whether it's old or not. So 30 years of waiting, it occurred to me that I could write it. And I had recently completed a book called Homes Down East, which I co-wrote with the Maine State historian and a local architect, that was focused on historic houses here in Maine. And when that book was finished, the publisher came to me and said, "So what other ideas have you got?" And I had several, but the one he really focused in on was the Comprehensive Guide for Restoring Historic Houses. And so we talked about it. I drafted an outline. We negotiated a contract, and I started what I did not know was going to be a 4.5-year process.
I can believe it, yes.
To end up with a 720-page hardcover book. The publisher was wonderful to work with. They're Tilbury House here in Maine, and arranged for the book to be distributed by W.W. Norton, so a major national publisher, so it would, reach all parts of the country. And so, I spent 4.5 years writing and putting together a volume that I'm really pleased with, and people are definitely responding to very positively. It just came out in December, The first printing pre-orders were such that the second printing was ordered before
that's great.
the release date. And so the second printing is underway. And the book this week, much of the week, has been #1 in the historic preservation category on Amazon. And it's just selling really well, and people are, letting me know that they're very happy with it. So
yes, well, and you did send me a copy of the file so that I could review it for the podcast, and I was very impressed, and I could just imagine how much time went into it when I saw the size of it. So I need to put it on my list to order to have a hard copy, but I can't imagine how big it is. I'm gonna have to find space on my bookcase for it. But I really like that you highlight different geographic areas, so you didn't just focus on one area of the country, because even though the old houses were put together similarly, there were geographic differences with the styles and so I thought that was really, really good. And I thought that one thing that I do when we do presentations is try to make sure the vocabulary, we're all speaking the same language. So, so I thought it was good that you talked about, rehabilitation versus restoration, because most people don't really want to restore a building. I mean, they think they do, but they don't want to take it back to where it was, before there were modern conveniences. So, and then, so I thought that I really enjoyed that. And then the review, when I first saw became aware of your book, the review that I read highlighted that it prioritized the identification and preservation of the historic character defining features of a house as a starting point of the process. And I think that's really smart, because, if all of those features are removed, you don't really have a historic building anymore. You just have like an old building that somebody has ripped everything out of.
Exactly.
So, but is that the reason that you took that approach, to make that more accessible to homeowners, or what was your vision with how you approached that?
Well, several things played into that. One is, although I watch very little television, I'm aware that there are a number of shows out there that really encourage people to buy an old house and gut it, and essentially put a new house into it. And, and as a preservationist, I have some concerns about that approach.
Right.
Unless a house is already significantly altered.
Right.
And in my work as a preservation consultant, I do a number of historic tax credit projects every year.
That's what I was going to ask you. The tax credits do deal with the whole package, but do you think some of the historic preservation guidelines for the historic district contribute to the gutting because they can't change the outside?
Well, there are a couple of things in play there. The work I do with the historic tax credits require that the project follow the Secretary of the Interior standards, which start with identifying the historic characteristics. That's true. Yeah, that's where that comes from. Yeah, and homeowners do not need to follow those standards, and I don't recommend that they do, but I think they can provide excellent guidance. Local historic district regulations are a separate but related topic. And I don't believe that they encourage the gutting of interiors because they don't address interiors.
And that's what I was. What I was thinking about.
I think they provide regulation typically for parts of the exterior that are visible from a public way.
Right.
So what someone does with the interior of their house in a local historic district is not affected by the ordinance. They
Right.
can restore it to its exact original appearance if they want,
Right.
or they can gut it. And the local ordinance doesn't really play into that decision.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you on that. I know that there's sections of Philadelphia where we worked on one house in particular in a block where every other house in the block, even though it's in the historic district, has been gutted, but their house is like the only one with the original interior also. And I think that people do. They want to live in the historic neighborhood, but they don't necessarily want an older house, which is something that you talk about in your book too, is, finding the right house for you. And I think sometimes people need better guidance with that.
Yeah, and there are lots of historic houses that have already had their interiors gutted or so dramatically altered that there's almost no historic fabric left to be concerned about. And those houses are perfect for the person who wants a house that looks historic outside but wants a really contemporary interior. I just would encourage them not to buy a really intact historic house and then gut it.
Right. Yes. So do you, I know you've done at least a few book signings. I know you came to York, Pennsylvania to do one. Have you gotten feedback from homeowners or mostly like preservation professionals? Like, are you feeling like it's resonating with multiple people?
I'm hearing primarily from homeowners.
Okay.
Because most preservation professionals don't focus on the individual home market.
Right.
Most professionals are working on commercial tax credit rehabs.
Right.
And so I'm hearing from lots of homeowners. The book has a Facebook page that's rapidly approaching 10,000 followers.
Oh, that's exciting.
And an Instagram that also is growing rapidly. It's over 3,000. So through social media, I've got a lot of contact with homeowners who are buying the book and letting me know what they think of it. And the response has been overwhelmingly positive. It's been very gratifying. After 4.5 years, essentially working alone, thinking, I hope to God people like this book.
Somebody's going to pay attention. Yes. I know that you mentioned, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I was going to say, I know you've mentioned the federal tax credits, and one thing I noticed in the book was that you highlighted different projects. And the project that was the picture that I saw of the promotion for the book and for your signing in York, Pennsylvania was the S. Nevin Hinch House, which was a Queen Anne style house. And I noticed that you said that they put a bed and breakfast in to help offset the cost of the project. Was that, and I thought that's really smart to try to show people, how you can, preserve something and also, make it make sense economically, because oftentimes it doesn't. And so was that a federal tax credit project, or was it just was that how they offset the cost?
In that case, they did not use historic tax credits. The retired couple who sold their home to save this house actually didn't know historic tax credits were available at the time.
Oh, okay.
That house was under a demolition order from the city. It was in really terrible condition after decades of neglect, and they were just determined to save it, and figured out, if we're going to save it, we need to have it make some money to recover some of those costs. And so that's how they determined to open a bed and breakfast. And, you know, they're a retired couple in a rather large house, so it also made sense to use some of the space. And it is one of 13 featured houses in the book. It happens to be the one that landed on the cover just because it's such a great-looking house. But these 13 featured houses are between the how-to chapters, and they range in date from 1760 to 1957, and they range geographically from Maine to Santa Fe, New Mexico. And they were all photographed by architectural photographer David Clough for the book. So Dave and I traveled to each, I missed one of them, but he traveled to every one of these houses.
Oh, very cool, yeah.
And took really spectacular photos because I wanted people to see completed projects. I wanted them to be able to be inspired by what other people have achieved and to hear those people's stories about how they saved their houses.
I think that emotional and human connection is really, because it's easy to like just look at these pictures of projects that are done, but if you can understand what the people went through, it makes it seem a little bit more attainable. So, and I did like that you included, you know, the mid-century modern, because that typically is not something that is focused on in preservation, but it's something that it's out there because they are old buildings now. And
Correct.
You know, meeting that 50-year threshold, and and those materials they're not the same as the materials that were used in the older buildings.
Yes.
And so I did like that you included those. So overall, I just think that the book is great, and I'm glad that you were able to come on to the podcast with us today too. So I know that you have a wide variety of knowledge and experience within restoration and preservation. Are there lessons that you have learned that you would like to share with the listeners?
I think the single most important lesson I've learned from my own historic house, as well as working on many other historic buildings, is to take the time to understand what it is before planning your changes.
Right.
You know, I look back at when I bought my 1827 house 17 years ago, and if I had rushed ahead with some of the first ideas I had, I would be living in regret today. You know, and I'll give you one example. The front parlor of the house has a small room behind it. And one of my first ideas was that I would remove the partition between them and make a larger parlor.
Right.
Fairly typical change someone might do.
Right.
I did not rush ahead and do that. And a year later, in conversation with Richard Nylander, who's former director of the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, now called Historic New England, and one of the leading experts on historic wallpapers in America, Richard identified that the wallpaper in the front parlor is an extremely rare 1830s American paper imitating a French paper, and is the only known example of it anywhere.
That's
so had
cool.
I ripped out that wall,
you would have lost that. Yeah.
Important wallpaper would have disappeared before I even knew what it was.
Right. Yeah.
So that to me was a really clarifying lesson in taking the time to understand what you're working with.
Yeah. That I agree, and I think that it's kind of like move in, live with it a little bit, see how you're going to use the space before you decide you're going to make these changes, because you don't some of the things that you want to do might not be exactly how you'll use the space anyway. I think that's something that I try to get people, those are the questions I ask when I'm going out to visit people and see what projects they're thinking about. So what are the biggest challenges that you see in preservation?
I think, fortunately, the preservation of historic homes seems to be growing. The interest in it and the number of people moving back to urban centers where many historic houses are located, that there seems to be a trend toward preserving historic houses, which is wonderful. And I think the challenge is that many or most of these people have not had access to good information to guide them in the process.
I agree.
And bad information is readily available. So I think that is the big challenge, is getting good information to the people who want to do a good job, but may not know how.
And I agree with that. Okay, and so you kind of talked about the trends that you see, that it's the increase is growing. Are there ways that you keep up with new information? Are there any resources that you tend to follow or use?
Well, I think there are a number of good resources out there. Old House Journal magazine is a classic. It's been around since 1979. No one has ever done a better job of providing good information to homeowners in particular. They're not targeting professionals. They're targeting the individual homeowner, and they do it very well. There have been periods in their history where I think they've done it less well, but they're back under the editorship of Patricia Poore, who was one of the founding editors and original owners, and I think she's got them back on track, and they are absolutely an excellent resource for anyone tackling this challenge.
Yes. Okay. So how can someone contact you to purchase the book? Is there?
Well, I would recommend that if they're on Facebook or Instagram, find Restoring Your Historic House. And I post daily new photos and information, and there are plenty of links there to my website, which is yourhistorichouse.com. And people can buy the book directly from me on the website. It's the only place you can get a signed copy.
Very cool.
But I'll tell you, you can get a cheaper copy on Amazon.
I will make sure that on our when we put the page up for the podcast, I'll put all of that information on, plus both links. I mean, the billionaires can afford to make less than the guy who wrote the book. So, but if you want a signed copy, you can get it directly from yourhistorichouse.com. Okay, very cool. Okay, and is there anything that you wanted to share that we didn't cover?
I am doing book signings periodically. Currently, mostly in northern New England. I'm looking at possibly doing a little bit of a tour down through the South in the fall. I hope to be out in Santa Fe in August, and hopefully can set up something out there at that point. But all events coming up are on the Facebook page. So
that's what I was going to ask. So they're all on social media. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Well, thank you so much for your time and for writing this book and doing that labor of love, because I'm sure there were times where it got hard, but I appreciate it, and I think it's a great resource.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for what you do to get
thank you.
information out there.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Practical Preservation Podcast. The resources discussed during this episode are on our website at practicalpreservationservices.com/podcast. If you received value from this episode and know someone else that will get value from it as well, please share it with them. Join us next week for another episode of the Practical Preservation Podcast. For more information on restoring your historic home, visit practicalpreservationservices.com.